Zora Vance was a woman whose life was measured in double shifts and dog-eared legal textbooks. Her only goal was to finish her paralegal certification, keep her younger sister fed, and hold on to the belief that doing things the right way still meant something. But on a dead quiet night at the tail end of a 12-hour shift, she found a wallet, a sleek, dark thing made of leather so soft it almost felt alive, packed tight with more cash than she'd see in 3 months of scrubbing tables. The owner was Jeong Syndicate, a man whose name wasn't spoken in polite company and whose influence ran through the city like rebar through concrete. What Zora didn't know, as she stood behind that grease-filmed counter, turning the matte black business card over in her trembling fingers, was that she hadn't just found a lost item. She had stepped into a carefully engineered audition. Returning the wallet was the honest thing to do, but it was also the first irreversible step into a world commanded by a patient, tattooed predator who didn't recruit people he could threaten. He recruited people he could obligate. Zora Vance was the kind of still, steady force that people underestimated. At 24, she split her existence cleanly in two. One half belonged to the sticky counters and burnt coffee fog of Remy's all-night diner, a neon-scarred holdout on the fraying edge of Midtown that served eggs at every hour and judgment at none, and the other half belonged to the fluorescent-lit classrooms of Metro Community College, where she was clawing her way through a paralegal certificate one case study at a time. She was deliberate, observant, and understood the arithmetic of survival down to the cent, usually the wrinkled, coffee-stained kind, tucked under a ketchup bottle by a trucker who thought 15% was generous. Her dark skin had a way of catching even the worst lighting and making it look intentional, and her white headband, always crisp, always in place, was less a fashion choice than a quiet declaration of order in a life that offered very little of it. Her smile, when she allowed it, could disarm the surliest 3 a.m. regular. She was powered by a vision she kept folded up tight in the back of her mind, like a letter she reread every night, a desk of her own, a nameplate, a career where her brain earned more than her feet. That vision was her compass. But the road to it was a long, unglamorous crawl through minimum wage, maximum exhaustion, and a rent check that arrived faster than her paycheck every single month. It was 2:15 a.m., and Remy's was settling into its graveyard shift silence. Zora was running a damp rag across the counter in slow, mechanical arcs, her thoughts already 3 hours ahead, rehearsing the contract law definitions she needed locked in before her 9 a.m. exam. Her lower back pulsed with the familiar low-grade protest of a body that had been upright too long on floors that gave nothing back. She glanced toward the far corner, Booth 9, the one wedged against the back wall where the overhead light had been dead for months, studying the space just vacated by her last and most unsettling customer of the night. He had been a disruption in the atmosphere, not by volume, but by density. Tall, East Asian, with dark hair swept sharply back and a jawline that looked engineered rather than inherited. He wore a navy blazer that probably cost more than her rent, worn open, no shirt beneath, revealing a broad chest and sculpted abdomen covered in elaborate tattoos, dark ink spiraling in ornate, almost ceremonial patterns from his waistline up over his collarbones and along both sides of his neck, disappearing just beneath his erline. His presence had pressed the air flat in the diner. The few remaining customers had gone quieter without knowing why. He had ordered black coffee, nothing else, sat with it for exactly 20 minutes without once looking at his phone, and paid with a single $100 bill for a $3 cup, no change requested, no conversation offered. His movements were minimal, fluid, and eerily silent, as though even his body understood the value of saying nothing. He was the kind of man who didn't leave a room. He subtracted himself from it, and everyone felt the new emptiness. As Zora moved to clear the booth, sliding across the cracked vinyl seat with her rag to catch a ring of condensation, her fingertips grazed something wedged deep into the seam where the cushion met the wall. She pulled it free. It was a wallet, but calling it that felt like calling the ocean a puddle. It was matte black, slim, made of a leather so fine-grained and weighted it seemed to hum with quiet authority, the kind of object that didn't come from a store, but from a house, some atelier in a country she'd never visit. It was the polar opposite of everything it sat among, The cracked seats, the stained menus, the peeling wallpaper. She opened it. But inside, $6,000 in new increased $100 bills, stacked with military precision. No ID, no credit cards, no photographs, just the cash. And a single matte black cardstock business card bearing nothing but a 10-digit phone number in silver embossed ink. No name, no title, no company. A profound wave of unease rolled through her, cold and slow, starting in her stomach and spreading outward until her fingers tingled against the leather. This wallet had not been forgotten. It had been placed. Zora stood behind the counter with the wallet in one hand and the black card in the other, and for a full 30 seconds, she did nothing but breathe. The diner hummed its low, empty hum, the refrigerator compressor cycling, the neon diner sign buzzing its eternal pink complaint against the window, a coffee pot ticking as it cooled on the burner. $6,000. She could feel the weight of it against her palm like a second heartbeat. $6,000 would clear 3 months of back rent. $6,000 would get Naya into the orthodontist before her jaw started shifting for good. $6,000 was the exact distance between drowning and standing up. She closed the wallet. She picked up the diner phone, the greasy beige landline mounted to the wall beside the pie case, and dialed the number on the card before the math in her head could finish its argument. He answered on the first ring, not the second, not after a pause to check the caller. The first ring, as if the phone had already been in his hand, as if he had been sitting somewhere in the dark geometry of the city with his thumb hovering over the green button, waiting for exactly this call from exactly this number. The voice that came through was low, unhurried, and carried the faint texture of amusement, not warm amusement, not the kind that invited you in, but the kind that suggested you had just confirmed something he already believed. "You found it," he said, not a question. Zora's mouth went dry. The way he said it, not my wallet, not something I left behind, just it, as though the object had a purpose beyond leather and cash, as though they were both already speaking in code. "You left a wallet," she said, "booth 9. I'm calling the number on the card inside. Tell me what's in it." She had counted the money. Of course she had counted the money. Her fingers had riffled through those bills with the speed of someone who reconciled a register every night and knew what a $100 stack felt like before her eyes confirmed it. But something in his tone, some calm, clinical quality, made her understand that this question was not about inventory. It was a measurement. He was testing the size of her honesty or the sophistication of her greed. "Some cash," she said. "I didn't count it." The lie left her mouth so cleanly it surprised her. She hadn't planned it. It had simply arrived, fully formed. Like a reflex she didn't know she owned, her first act of self-preservation in a conversation she didn't yet understand was dangerous. On the other end of the line, the silence lasted exactly 2 beats. She could have sworn she heard him smile. "A car will be there in 10 minutes, he said. "A black Escalade. The driver's name is Mr. Kwan. Hand him the wallet. He will hand you an envelope. Take it." The line went dead. No goodbye, no thank you, no negotiation. Just a set of instructions delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who had never once been told no by someone who understood the cost of saying it. Zora hung up the phone and looked at the clock above the pie case. 2:22 a.m. She had 12 minutes. She untied her apron, folded it on the counter, and waited. It arrived 2 minutes early. The Escalade materialized from the dark end of the block like something that had been parked there all along, just waiting for permission to exist. Matte black, no chrome, no plates she could read from behind the counter glass, just a long, silent shape that rolled to a stop directly beneath the diner's neon sign. Its engine so quiet, Zora felt its arrival more than she heard it. The headlights cut off. Nothing moved. Then the driver's door opened with the soft, pressurized click of something expensive, and a man stepped out. He was Korean, mid-40s, built like a refrigerator someone had put in a charcoal suit. His face offered nothing. No greeting, no curiosity, no irritation at being dispatched to a grease-stained diner at 2 a.m. He walked to the entrance with the mechanical economy of someone who had done this exact errand 100 times and never once considered it beneath him. The bell above the door chimed once. He stopped 3 paces inside, scanned the room the way a person checks a lock, and fixed his eyes on Zora. "Miss Vance." It was not a question. He already knew her name, and the fact that he used it, rather than asking for the woman who called, sent a cold wire of awareness threading down her spine. She had given no name on the phone. Jeong had not asked for one. "Mr. Kwon?" she said. He gave a single nod, the kind that closed a topic rather than opened one. Zora reached beneath the counter where she had set the wallet and held it out. Kwon took it with one hand, didn't inspect it, didn't open it. Didn't count, and with the other produced a thick ivory envelope from inside his jacket. He placed it on the counter between them with the delicacy of someone setting down a loaded thing. "From Mr. Jeong," he said. Then he turned, walked back through the door, folded himself into the Escalade, and was gone before the bell finished ringing. Zora stood alone in the empty diner, the envelope warm under the fluorescent light. She opened it. Inside, $80 bills, crisp and banded, and a single folded note written in black ink on heavy cream paper, the handwriting sharp and slanted and unhurried. 5 words. "Integrity is rare. I remember rare things. $8,000, $2,000 more than what was in the wallet." She stared at the money and felt something she hadn't expected, not relief, not gratitude, but the faint, sour vertigo of being appraised. This was not a thank you. It was a receipt. Somewhere in the dark, a man she'd never properly met had assigned a dollar value to her character, and the number was higher than she was comfortable with. She put the money in her bag. Naya's orthodontist consultation was in 9 days. The landlord's final notice was pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a strawberry. These were facts. Facts did not negotiate with unease. She locked the diner, walked to her car, and told herself it was over. A strange night, a strange man, a strange windfall, and nothing more. The engine turned over on the 3rd try. She pulled out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, Remy's neon sign shrank to a pink dot and disappeared. Zora drove home with $8,000 in her bag and the quiet, but bone-deep certainty that something had just started that she did not yet have a name for. 3 months passed, and Zora let herself believe the story was over. She used the $8,000 the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, without waste. Naya got her braces. The landlord got 3 months of back rent and a 4th in advance. The remaining $1,200 went to enrollment at Metro Community College's paralegal certification program, a night and weekend track designed for people who couldn't afford to stop working while they started becoming something else. For the first time in years, Zora's life had a forward motion that wasn't just survival dressed up in ambition. She was learning. Contract law, civil procedure, legal research and writing. Her mind, so long spent calculating tips and tracking closing duties, turned out to be wired for the architecture of argument. Her professors noticed. Her grades climbed. She still worked at Remy's 4 nights a week, but the diner had shifted from the center of her life to its margin, and the difference felt like breathing after being underwater. It was a Tuesday evening in October when the air changed. Zora was seated in the 3rd row of Professor Achebe's legal ethics seminar, a small lecture hall with stadium seating and lighting the color of weak tea, taking notes on prosecutorial discretion and the boundaries of confidential obligation. The room held maybe 40 students. She knew most of them by sight, a few by name. She did not know the man in the last row. She felt him before she saw him. A shift in the room's gravity, a subtle compression of attention toward the back wall. As if she turned her head, not quickly, not with alarm, but with the slow, certain rotation of someone whose body had already identified a threat before her conscious mind caught up. Jeong Jian sat in the farthest seat of the top row, arms folded across his chest, his navy blazer buttoned once over a dark shirt, the ornate edges of his neck tattoos climbing just above the collar like ivy over a wall. He was watching the lecture. He was watching her. His expression was perfectly neutral, the kind of calm that could mean anything, and therefore meant everything. Zora faced forward. Her pen did not stop moving. Her handwriting for the next 35 minutes was flawless and meant nothing. Her mind had left the room and was now circling the man in the back row the way a bird circles something it cannot yet identify as food or danger. Class ended. Students filed out. Zora took her time packing her bag, and when she looked up, Jian was standing at the end of her row, hands in his pockets, as though he had simply materialized there between one breath and the next. "You're doing well," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered, low, measured, carrying the faint residue of amusement. "Top of your cohort. Professor Achebe speaks highly." The fact that he knew her professor's name by heart should have been the thing that frightened her. It wasn't. It was the word cohort, a word that meant he hadn't just looked her up, he had read her transcripts. "What do you want?" she said. Jeong tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's deciding how much truth a person can absorb in one sitting. "Full tuition," he said. "A furnished apartment downtown, a monthly stipend. In exchange, you make yourself available when I call. No drugs, no violence, paperwork." He paused. "You're good with paperwork, Zora." Her name in his mouth was a door, swinging open onto a hallway she couldn't see the end of. She should have said no. She should have picked up her bag, walked past him, driven home, and locked the door. But Jeong didn't rush her. He didn't press. He simply stood there in the fluorescent quiet of the emptying lecture hall, patient as a tide, and let the offer do what offers do when they're made to people who are already tired of choosing between rent and tomorrow. She said she'd think about it. He said he knew she would. And then he was gone. Down the stairs, through the door, into whatever black vehicle was waiting in the lot. And Zora was left standing in the third row of a legal ethics class, and holding a bag full of textbooks about justice and a decision that had nothing to do with it. She said yes on a Thursday. By Saturday, the loft was hers. It occupied the 14th floor of a glass and steel building on Whitmore Avenue, the kind of address Zora had only ever known as a series of lit windows seen from a bus. The key came in a padded envelope delivered to Remy's by a courier who didn't ask her to sign anything. Inside the loft, everything was new. Not new the way Zora understood new. Clearance rack new, thrift store new, someone else decided they didn't want it new. This was first owner new. The couch was a deep charcoal sectional that smelled like the inside of a showroom. The bed was king-sized, dressed in white linens so crisp they looked architectural. The kitchen had a refrigerator with a screen on it. Already stocked. Produce she hadn't bought. Milk that wasn't expired. A carton of eggs arranged in rows like they'd been placed by someone with a ruler. In the bedroom closet, 6 work-appropriate outfits, all in her size, all in muted professional tones, navies, charcoals, soft whites, as though someone had studied what a paralegal should look like and purchased accordingly. On the desk by the window, still sealed in its box, sat a laptop, a good one, the kind with a weight that suggested it could actually do what it promised. Zora walked through the apartment slowly, touching things. She ran her fingers along the countertop. She opened and closed cabinets. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city she had been living beneath for 24 years. A city that looked entirely different from the 14th floor. Cleaner, quieter, almost gentle. Naya would have her own room here. Naya would have a desk that wasn't the kitchen table. For 5 full minutes, Zora stood at that window and allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to gratitude. Then, she saw the phone. It sat on the kitchen counter, just left of the stove, positioned with the same deliberate care as everything else in the apartment. A small, matte black handset. Not a smartphone, not anything with a screen that could be traced or hacked or subpoenaed. A burner, simple, prepaid, anonymous. She picked it up, thumbed the power button, and watched the screen glow to life. 1 contact, no name, just a letter. J. The phone weighed almost nothing, 4 ounces, maybe 5, but standing there in that beautiful, silent apartment, Zora felt the full mass of what it represented settle into her hand like a stone dropped into still water. This phone would not ring with good news. It would not ring with invitations or check-ins or friendly updates. When this phone rang, it would mean that the life around her, the loft, the laptop, the closet full of clothes that fit, had come due. It was not a gift. Gifts do not come with a single contact and no instructions. It was a leash, elegant and wireless, and it connected her to a man who had never once raised his voice because he had never needed to. Zora set the phone down on the counter. She did not turn it off. She did not put it in a drawer. She did not throw it away. She left it exactly where it was, beside the stove beneath the soft pendant light, and went to unpack her sister's things. The phone sat there, dark and patient, and waited the way its owner waited. It had time. 6 weeks of silence. The phone sat on the counter like a black tooth, and it did not ring. Zora went to class. She studied. She cooked dinner for Naya in a kitchen that still smelled like someone else's idea of home. She passed her midterms with the highest marks in the cohort. She began to entertain a fragile, half-formed theory that maybe the phone was decorative, a symbol, not a summons. Maybe Jeong had simply wanted to know she was there, reachable in principle, and would never actually call. Maybe the leash was long enough to forget it existed. It rang at 1:07 a.m. on a Wednesday in November. The sound was nothing special, a thin, generic trill. The factory default of a device too cheap to customize, but it detonated the silence of the apartment like a hammer through glass. Zora was in bed, not sleeping, reviewing case citations on her laptop with Naya asleep one wall away. She stared at the ceiling for 3 rings, then got up, walked to the kitchen in bare feet, and answered. "There's an envelope on your doorstep," Jeong said. No greeting, no apology for the hour. His voice carried the same unhurried cadence as the night in the diner, as though 1 a.m. and 1 p.m. were the same hour in whatever world he inhabited. "A notarized document inside. I need it delivered to a warehouse on Creston Avenue, East Side, Unit 14. The men there are expecting you." "Now?" she said. "Now." She found the envelope outside her front door, manila, sealed, heavier than a single document should be. Though she did not open it, she put on jeans and a jacket, slipped on her shoes, took her car keys from the hook by the door, and checked on Naya one last time, still sleeping, mouth slightly open, one arm hanging off the bed like a question mark, before pulling the front door shut behind her. The drive took 22 minutes through rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to fall or just hang in the air like a threat. The city at 1:30 a.m. was a different animal. Empty intersections blinking yellow, storefronts grated shut, the wet streets reflecting back every light source in long, warped streaks that made the road look like it was melting. Zora drove with both hands on the wheel, fingers pressed so hard into the leather that her knuckles ached. She told herself this was an errand, a delivery. When people delivered things at odd hours all the time, nurses, pharmacists, journalists, this was paperwork. She was good with paperwork. He had said so himself. The warehouse was a low corrugated building behind a chain-link fence that someone had left open. 2 men stood outside Unit 14 beneath a bare bulb, both in dark jackets, both perfectly still. When Zora pulled up, the taller one stepped forward, took the envelope through her open window, nodded once and said, "Thank you, Miss Vance. Drive safe." Polite. Professional. Like receiving a FedEx package at 1:45 in the morning was the most natural transaction in the world. She drove home under rain that had finally committed to falling. The streets were empty. The errand was done. Simple, clean, unremarkable. She parked, climbed the stairs, let herself back into the apartment, and locked the door. The loft was quiet. Naya hadn't stirred. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The laptop still open on her bed, the kitchen light still on, the black phone back on the counter, silent again. Satisfied. Zora stood at the kitchen sink and poured herself a glass of water. She raised it to her lips. The water trembled. She looked down at her hands and found them shaking, not violently, not the kind of shaking anyone else would notice, but a fine, persistent vibration running from her wrists to her fingertips, as though her body had kept a tab her mind refused to open. She set the glass down, gripped the edge of the counter, and breathed. In the next room, her sister slept. On the counter, the phone rested. Outside, the rain fell on a city that didn't know her name. Oh, and Zora Vance stood in her furnished cage and told herself that what had just happened was nothing. Her hands disagreed. The second call came 10 days later. The third, 8 days after that. By January, the phone rang on its own schedule, sometimes twice a week, sometimes not for 19 days, and Zora stopped flinching when it did. That was the thing about repetition. It didn't make the wrong thing right. It just made it quiet. The tasks were small. That was the design. A notarized affidavit witnessed at a law office in Koreatown where no one asked why she was there and everyone already knew her name. A property transfer document delivered to a title company that operated out of a converted nail salon on 8th Street, the receptionist smiling and stamping as though midnight filings were standard business practice. A backdated lease agreement for a commercial unit Zora was fairly certain had never been occupied by whatever company was listed on the paperwork. Each favor existed in the gray space between illegal and inadvisable, never quite enough to constitute a crime, never clean enough to survive scrutiny. They were designed to be deniable, and Zora was beginning to understand that deniability was Jeon's native language. He did not build his empire on violence alone. He built it on paper, on signatures and filing dates and corporate shells that nested inside each other like matryoshka dolls, each one legal in isolation, catastrophic in aggregate. And Zora was reading every page, not because she was asked to. Jeon never told her to examine the documents, only to deliver them. But she was a paralegal student with a GPA that bordered on compulsive, and the paperwork that passed through her hands was more instructive than anything in her coursework. She began to see the shape of things, shell companies registered in Delaware that funneled into holding groups in Nevada, real estate acquisitions that clustered around 3 zip codes on the east side, forming a corridor she could trace on a map with her finger. Names that recurred across filings, some Korean, some Anglo, some clearly invented, orbiting a center of gravity that was never named on any document but was present in all of them. Jeong didn't appear in his own paperwork. He existed in the negative space, the unsigned line, the entity listed only as managing principal. He was an architecture of absence, and Zora was learning to read blueprints. By March, she could sketch the Jeong Syndicate's financial anatomy from memory. The legitimate fronts, the layered LLCs, the property pipeline, the probable money flow. She knew the names of Jeon's lawyers, his accountants, the 3 notaries he kept on informal retainer. She knew which warehouse on Creston Avenue served as a distribution node and which served as storage for documents that should have been destroyed. She knew more than any outsider had a right to know, and one night, lying in bed with her laptop closed on her chest and the city glowing through the window, the realization arrived with the weight of a door locking behind her. Jeon was not simply using her for errands. He was building her. Every document she carried was a brick in her education, every delivery a lesson in how his world was wired. That he was turning her into something fluent in his empire's grammar, and fluency in Jeon's world was not a skill you acquired and walked away from. It was a debt. It was a leash made of knowledge instead of money, and it was already too short to slip. Investments, Zora understood from her coursework, are instruments of expectation. They are not given, they are placed, and the return is always collected. The text came from a number she didn't recognize, not the burner, not Jeon's line, something new and disposable. An address, a time, no explanation. Zora had learned by now that Jeon communicated the way a scalpel worked, one cut, no redundancy. She arrived at the address at 9 p.m. on a Friday and found herself standing at the base of a glass tower in the financial district. It was the kind of building that existed to remind the street below that it was the street below. A man in a black overcoat was waiting at a side entrance. He didn't introduce himself. He held the door, pressed a keycard to the elevator panel, and selected the roof. The lounge occupied the building's top floor like a crown it hadn't asked permission to wear. The ceiling was retractable, open tonight to a clear April sky, and the city spread out beneath it in every direction, 1,000,000 lit windows, 1,000,000 small lives, all of them far below. The decor was minimal, expensive, and deliberately underlit, the kind of darkness that cost more than light. There were 7 men in the room, seated or standing at various distances from a long onyx table near the terrace edge. And every one of them oriented toward the man at its head, the way iron filings orient toward a magnet. Jeong sat at the far end of the table with one ankle crossed over the opposite knee and a glass of something untouched in front of him. His blazer was charcoal tonight, cut close, worn open over a black shirt unbuttoned to the sternum, enough to expose the dense spiraling ink that covered his chest and climbed his neck in dark, ornate patterns that caught the city light and seemed to shift with his breathing, as though the tattoos were not drawn on his skin but living just beneath it. His hair was swept back. His expression was the same expression it always was, Calm, observational, a face built for decisions that didn't require consultation. But here, in this room, surrounded by men who moved around him with the careful choreography of people who understood proximity to power as both a privilege and a hazard, Jeong looked like what he was for the first time. Not a voice on a phone, not a man in a lecture hall, a sovereign. The men around him didn't serve him out of loyalty or love. They served him because the alternative was architectural. It would collapse things. He saw Zora enter and gestured to the chair across from him with 2 fingers. She sat. The men didn't acknowledge her. She understood this too. She was not being introduced because she did not exist in this room's official record. Jeong studied her for a moment, then slid a sealed envelope across the onyx surface. White, unmarked, heavier than it looked. Federal Judge Carlin, he said. The parking structure on Chambers Street. Level 4, northwest corner. Midnight tomorrow? He paused. This is the last favor, Zora. She looked at the envelope. She looked at him. His voice had said last. His eyes, dark and steady, and ancient with a patience that predated her involvement by years, said something else entirely. They said, "This is the first thing I've asked you that you'll remember for the rest of your life." Zora picked up the envelope. It weighed almost nothing. It weighed everything. She put it in her bag, stood, and walked to the elevator without looking back, because she understood that looking back was a form of hesitation, and hesitation, in this room, was a language Jeong could read. The elevator doors closed. The city dropped away beneath her, floor by floor, and Zora descended back toward the street with a sealed envelope and the clear, uncold knowledge that the word last in Jeong's mouth had never once meant what it was supposed to. She opened the envelope at 10:47 p.m. in the bathroom of her loft with the door locked and the exhaust fan running, as though the noise might grant her some kind of absolution. A kettle, a steady hand, 60 seconds of steam. The seal gave way cleanly, and Zora slid the contents onto the counter and read them standing up, her reflection watching from the mirror like a witness she couldn't dismiss. It was a witness statement. 3 pages, typed, formatted with the precise margins and citation style of a legitimate federal filing. The statement placed a man named Dae-Jung Park at the scene of a money laundering operation in explicit prosecutable detail. Dates, amounts, account numbers, a narrative so clean and sequential, it read less like testimony and more like a script. It was also, Zora knew within 90 seconds, a fabrication. The notary stamp was from a firm she had delivered documents to twice. The account numbers followed a pattern she recognized from Jeong's own shell network. And the witness named on the signature line had been dead for 11 months. She had filed the estate transfer herself in December. This statement would put Dae-Jung Park in federal prison for life. That was its purpose. That was Jeong's purpose. And Zora was the hand that would carry it to the bench. She sat on the edge of the bathtub and pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw white. Every lecture, every case study, every ethics module she had absorbed over the past 9 months converged on a single, screaming frequency. This is the line. Not a gray area, not a technicality. A forged witness statement delivered to a federal judge was a felony, for the judge, for the forger, and for the courier who knew what she was carrying. If she delivered this document as written, she would become an accessory to the wrongful imprisonment of a man she had never met, and the architecture of that crime would include her fingerprints. But if she didn't deliver it, she would lose everything: the apartment, the tuition, the stipend, Naya's stability. And possibly more, because people who disappointed Jeong did not simply return to their old lives. They disappeared from the new one. Zora sat in that bathroom for 31 minutes. Then she opened her laptop, pulled up the federal sentencing guidelines she had memorized for her final exam, inked and began to write. She didn't destroy Jeong's statement. She restructured it. She stripped the fabricated witness testimony and replaced it with a reframed argument rooted in immigration law, a jurisdictional technicality that reclassified Park's alleged offenses as grounds for expedited deportation rather than criminal prosecution. The result was the same from Jeong's perspective. Park would be removed, neutralized, eliminated from the competitive landscape. But he would be deported, not imprisoned. Alive, not buried in a federal cell on perjured testimony. It was a loophole the size of a needle's eye, and Zora threaded it with the steady hands of a woman who had spent a year learning to read blueprints she was never supposed to understand. She resealed the envelope with a glue stick and a clothing iron. It looked untouched. At 11:58 p.m., Zora stood alone on the 4th level of the Chambers Street parking structure, the concrete stretching around her in every direction like the rib cage of something enormous and hollow. Her footsteps echoed. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed in intervals, casting the kind of light that made shadows look like they were breathing. She held the envelope at her side and waited. At midnight exactly, a silver sedan pulled into the northwest corner. The rear window lowered 3 inches. A hand extended, pale, manicured, bearing a gold university ring. Zora placed the envelope into it. The hand withdrew. The window rose. The sedan reversed, turned, and descended the ramp in a slow, unhurried spiral, its taillights painting red arcs on the concrete walls until they vanished. No words were exchanged. None were expected. Zora stood in the empty garage for a full minute after the car was gone, listening to the silence reorganize itself around her. Then she walked back to her car, sat behind the wheel, and placed her hands at 10 and 2. They were not shaking. For the first time in a year, her hands were perfectly still, and that, more than anything, frightened her. Jeong found out in 48 hours. Zora didn't know how, whether the judge reported the discrepancy, whether one of Jeong's lawyers compared the delivered document against an original draft, whether Jeong himself had built some verification mechanism into the envelope that she hadn't detected. It didn't matter. What mattered was the phone call that came on Sunday evening at 6:15 p.m. Not the burner, but her personal cell. Saw a number she had never given him, and the 4 words delivered in a voice so flat it had no temperature at all. My office, 1 hour. The office was a room she hadn't known existed, buried in the back of a Korean restaurant in Flushing that had no signage and no menu, and seated exactly 0 customers despite being immaculately maintained. Kwon was waiting at the door. He didn't greet her. He didn't look at her. That absence of acknowledgement was its own language, and it said, "Whatever happens next is above my clearance and below my sympathy." Jeong was seated behind a heavy wooden desk in a windowless room lit by a single brass lamp. His blazer was off, hung on the back of his chair, and his tattoos were fully visible in the warm light, dark ink tracing the topography of his shoulders, his chest, his neck. The patterns so dense and deliberate they looked like scripture in a language only his body could read. He did not stand when Zora entered. He did not gesture to a chair. He simply watched her, and the silence that filled the room was the kind Zora imagined preceded very specific and irreversible decisions. "You opened the envelope," he said. It was not a question. Zora did not insult him by treating it as one. "Yes." "You rewrote the statement?" "Yes." The silence returned. It lasted long enough for Zora to hear her own pulse in her ears, to count the brass rivets on the edge of his desk, to wonder whether Kwon was still standing on the other side of the door or whether he had already left because he knew what was coming. Jeong's expression did not change. His posture did not shift. But something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not admiration, something more tectonic than either. A slow recalibration of a man reassessing a variable he had believed was fixed. "Park was deported yesterday," he said finally. "My lawyers spent 3 months building that witness statement. It would have put him away for life." He paused. "Your version removed him from the country in 9 days. No trial, no media, no discovery process that could have surfaced my name." Another pause, longer this time. "My own people missed that." Zora said nothing. She understood that this was not the moment for explanation or defense. This was the moment to be still and let the result speak in the only language Jeong respected. Outcome. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her the way a man looks at a weapon he had mistaken for a decoration, not with warmth, not with gratitude, with the cold, the luminous clarity of someone recognizing that the thing he had built had exceeded its design. "You changed the terms," he said. Zora met his gaze, held it. Let the silence sit between them like a third presence at the table, not empty silence, but the dense charged kind that exists between two people who have just discovered they are operating at the same altitude. I improved them, she said. Jeong didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth shifted by a degree so slight it could have been imagined. And in that fraction of movement, Zora read an entire language, respect, recalculation, and something that might have been the closest a man like Jeong ever came to being impressed. Within a week, the loft on Whitmore Avenue was emptied. Zora and Naya were moved to a gated residential estate 40 minutes north of the city, a stone and glass compound set behind mature oaks, staffed by people who addressed Zora as Miss Vance without being told to, as though her name had been circulated in a memo she never saw. The burner phone was collected by Kwan and replaced with an encrypted device, slim and silver, loaded with contacts she recognized from the paperwork she had been carrying for months. She was no longer a courier. She was no longer a favor. She had a desk now, in a room adjacent to Jeong's office, and on that desk sat a laptop, a legal pad, and a nameplate that read nothing at all, because in the Jeong Syndicate, the people who mattered most were the ones whose names appeared nowhere. Zora stood at the window of her new room that first night, Naya asleep down the hall, in a bed larger than their old living room, and looked out at the dark tree line and the distant haze of the city she had come from. She thought about the diner. She thought about the wallet on booth 9, the greasy phone, the trembling hands, the woman she had been 14 months ago who believed that honesty was a shield. It wasn't. It was a signal flare, and Jeong had been scanning the horizon. She was no longer Zora Vance, the waitress who did the right thing. She was the Jeong Syndicate's secret architecture, the legal mind behind the walls, the conscience of a kingdom that was never supposed to have one. And the most dangerous thing about her was not what she knew. It was that she had looked at the line, understood exactly what it was, and found a way to redraw it. The encrypted phone sat on her nightstand, fully charged, waiting. This time, Zora didn't look at it with dread. She looked at it the way Jeong looked at everything, with patience, with calculation, and with the quiet certainty that whatever came next, she would be ready.